You can't replace part of the brain. Like, you
treat them the same.
The source of truth for the Medtech industry.
Coexists with the prophets.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the Medtech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the 90s, built $1 billion company that held up high, a lot of things.
Stayed in Medtech with your host, Omar and Khateeb.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. Excited to have our guest today, and especially the fact that we can make this work out because I literally made him spend the last 10 minutes like changing positions to make sure that we get the right sound. So I really appreciate it. Desai, Chief Strategic Innovation Officer over at Insightec, and now good friend. There's a few people, there's some names that I always, hear about in the industry, people who have a really great reputation. JJ's one of them. I've heard his name be brought up by some of the more influential people in our industry. And so it's nice to finally connect with you. We had a great conversation a couple weeks ago. So JJ, thanks for coming on the show. How are you doing today?
Omar, living the dream, man. Appreciate connecting with you. Happy Friday. And it's a privilege to be on your show. Likewise, you represent the best of our industry. So it's always a pleasure.
I really appreciate that. And I'm very honored that you're doing this because our mutual friend, prolific investor, and one of the founders of Mako, Chris Dewey, came on the show last week, and you passed on golf at Indian Creek. For those who don't know, Indian Creek is this amazing club that is private. You have to be invited there. So JJ told Chris Dewey, I can't go to golf today because you're doing this podcast. So I feel pretty honored about that. Chris, I'm so sorry. We'll make it up. We'll do the golf another day. So
we'll make it up for sure.
Let's start out maybe a little bit about your background, because you have a very interesting background. You were previously a physician and you have a really amazing and deep history in this industry. But maybe start where exactly did you grow up and how did you get into medicine?
Yeah, I grew up in Southern California, born and raised. My dad came over from India when he was 20 and landed in Oklahoma and studied nuclear and chemical engineering. I met my mom in Louisiana and they migrated to California. So I'm the third of an older brother and an older sister, and had the benefit of just shared mutual knowledge between my parents, my siblings, in picking my endeavor in life. Growing up in Southern California, you can imagine, loved the ocean, loved the outdoors, loved everything active. That also instilled in me a health and wellness perspective. And being the son of an Indian male, you prophetically had three opportunities: engineering, medicine, or computer.
Or law. Yeah, we got the same rule for Middle Eastern people. So I feel like there's that connection between Middle Eastern people and Indians. We feel the same pain from our parents.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, it was always very clear. I loved healthcare. And to the point where when I was little, I would always say, I want to be an astronaut or I want to be a firefighter. And my dad would always say, great, be a doctor, then you can be an astronaut, or be a doctor, then you can be a firefighter. And so I took that as sage advice. And thinking about healthcare, I always approach it from different areas. The first real impact healthcare had in my life was at the NGO level, and thinking about contributing to healthcare in a way where I could make a difference in the third worlds in a clinical setting, and getting involved very early on with organizations like Rotary Club and community service organizations that had made huge, profound differences in the world through introducing something like the polio vaccine, and not just introducing it, but having a strategy to implore it worldwide and eradicate polio. These are the types of ambitions that really inspired me. Eradication, cures, differential movements, and the time equations of disease states for history. And I see that play out in themes throughout my life and my career, and being really inspired by folks who invented entirely new ways of approaching disease sets, like, hey, we can stick a little wire into arteries and reach your heart as opposed to cutting your chest open, or we can cure HIV and AIDS, or we can make hepatitis C a chronic disease. Those were the influences that sort of originally inclined me to healthcare. And I took this non-linear journey, but I ended up exactly where I was intended to be and am intended to be currently. And that's one of just the most beautiful things of the serendipity of these pathways. You can't predict them, but you end up exactly where you should be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's interesting when you look at, if you don't have I don't think anything in life is really linear, but especially if you go on a non-linear path, moving forward, you can never tell how the dots are supposed to connect. But then looking back, it makes complete sense. So at least for me, the goal, having a father as a surgeon, I wanted to be a surgeon. went to medical school in Texas, and then I dropped out halfway through. And that was well over 12 years ago. And I remember when I left, I wonder if you went through the same thing, which is, so for you actually you completed residency, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you became a real doctor. I went through medical school. I dropped out before step one. And so one of the things about being in medical school is that the moment you get in, you immediately have this unearned respect from people because I'm a medical student, and that equates to doctors. So you have automatic this identity of respect that you did nothing to do to earn. And so when I left medical school, I had this sort of identity crisis where I'm like, I'm not going to be a doctor. That's no longer my identity. I had to figure out like my way in the world. I wonder, when you left, when you decided to leave, first of all, when you finished residency and decided not to pursue a path in clinical medicine, what was the first thing that you did? And did you go through that same kind of like identity? I don't want to call it a crisis, but yeah, like this sort of transformation of who am I and what's my identity now? And how do I explain to people, what do I do?
Yeah, I remember. So maybe I'll walk it back a bit because I think this question started even in college for me. And I was constantly in exploration mode. In college, I was always trying to figure out where in healthcare I would approach it to have a macro impact, always assuming that I would do it as a physician, as a doctor. And my first sort of thought was, legislatively, I want to be a part of healthcare at the governance perspective. And so I interned for my local congressional representative, Christopher Cox at the time, who was in the House leadership. And I showed up to Washington one summer and totally inspired. Still, every time I land in DC, it gives me goosebumps, like just the sort of constitutional shaping of our entire society that still resides in those cities and cities around the world that are capital cities still inspires me. So showing up in Washington, I thought, man, I found it. This is my calling in life. And I got to work within the House Policy Committee and sit in effectively as an intern. I'm not really contributing as much as I think I am, but sit in with the likes of Bobby Jindal, who was one of the youngest ever presidents of a health system, the Louisiana State Health System, governor of Louisiana, historically medically trained, and look at the Medicare legislature that was coming in for the early setting of Medicaid and Medicare as it was being repurposed at that time in the early 2000s, and meet Henry Kissinger and look at all of these different sort of prophetic individuals that were changing the landscape. And I very quickly came to the realization, this is not how I want to impact healthcare. And a lot of it was how slow and morass it was, but also that you always had to reach some conflicted negotiation. There wasn't this pure thought of, here's how I'm going to do it. Here's how I want to do it. Let me move fast and quick and get it done. There was here's the right way to do it. Here's the way we're probably going to do it. And this is the amount of time it's going to take to get there. But it was an unbelievable understanding because, as you're aware, the G Suite in medicine, especially as you're trying to impact it from a new technology perspective, is equally, if not more important today than it was 20 years ago. That freaks me out to say 20 years ago, but that's exactly when it was for me when I was going through this. And that learning helped me a lot. So then I marched on my way, and then I was this NGO sort of, okay, I'm going to be a Doctor Without Borders. And I spent the year in between college and medical school, and I moved to Singapore, and I represented a project that I had been able to really help work on intimately with a dear family friend called Project Deaf India. And this had a simple task. It was bringing the MMR vaccine forward into young children worldwide that didn't have exposure to it. It's a beautiful triple therapy, and it prevents newborn deafness, and it amongst other things. And was able to set up and establish clinics everywhere from the Sarawak jungles in Borneo to Malaysia and beyond in New Zealand, and talk a lot about the impact of this as a Rotarian ambassador of goodwill and a delegate of the State Department for the United States. And that really inspired me. And so much so that it determined how and what I thought I was going to be in medicine and go to medical school, which is how I landed at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. Because from day one, you throw a white coat on, you're in Jackson Memorial Hospital, which is probably the best ground zero medical education you can get. You're in the hospital day one. There was no coat ceremony per se. There was an official one at the end of the day, but you literally get a long white coat and you're in there helping everybody out because they need the help of disease detection and treatment in that location. And we had the chance to go to Haiti and Nicaragua and all these amazing, we took the entire class to India, and that left an indelible impact on me. But I didn't scratch the itch. It wasn't, man, this is exactly what I'm going to be doing. And I peeled around a little bit and tried to do quality health systems. And I thought maybe I'll be the CEO of a hospital. Wouldn't that be really cool? And finally, as I transitioned from medical school to residency, I started serendipitously getting involved with these new ideas forming into companies. A drug delivery system using electrical stimulation to get a medicine across. My roommate in medical school was in an immuno-oncology lab and had taken a molecule out and created a company around it. So a tech transfer process. And we were always in conversation. And there was something there that I said, okay, this is it. I don't know what it is, but this is it. And as I decided where I wanted to do my residency, I picked two locations, Harvard, which had an MIT correlate where I could explore and dig. And there was a openness, I would say, to dual pathing a clinical and entrepreneurial spirit. And Stanford, which was always my number one ideal. I further reinforced that and spent more time. And that's obviously where I ended up going and helping to start my career in entrepreneurial medicine, which was the byproduct of a couple different things. My environment, all of these collective learnings along the way of exactly where I should be placing myself, and key mentors, which I think you and I have discussed and would love to dig into a little bit because it really shaped my life. But I'll say two important things before we dig in on those lines of questions. The first one was I thought I wanted to be a venture capitalist. And I had this idea that was the way that I could find technologies and do it. And I probably cold called 100 or 150 venture capitalists. And I remember, and they were all doctors. They were all doctors who became venture capitalists. And I remember thinking one very specific thing. All the ones that I called that just went to medical school or just finished their first year of residency, they always called themselves Dr. Joan, Dr. Tim, Dr. Alex. And the ones that had been prophetic doctors, scientists, MD, PhDs, had evolved out of their careers in medicine into this field, said, oh, just call me John, call me Mike, call me Alexandra, call me Michelle. And there was this sense of completeness about them. And every time I said, should I stop now? Should I stop at medical school? Should I stop my first year? I always went back to those conversations and I said, you know what? I'm never going to know as much as I can about medicine to impact it the way I want to impact it unless I am solely responsible for a patient and the care of that patient. And I can tell you, leaving medical school thinking I knew everything, you get to your first year residency, you realize nothing. And then going through residency and then your first year as an attending, every single time, whether it's how to treat a patient, how to think about pre-op, how to get insurance, how to actually approach a disease set, how to team manage, there's different levels of education. And so that was really important. And the second one was a very wise senior resident when I first got to Stanford, who had met me in this journey outside of my clinical practice, said, I have one piece of advice for you. Don't let anyone know what you're doing. And I remember being really struck by that and saying, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, I'm here in the bastion of clinical innovation or technological innovation, and my whole goal here is to create a sense of community. And he said, yeah, in clinical medicine, there's I should be doing that mentality sometimes. And it's pervasive, and people will look at you and not enjoy your success to some extent. And I don't say this broadly, but I think any clinical person would get the sense of this, especially in academic medicine. They wouldn't necessarily say, oh, that's amazing. Their first thought would be like, well, I should be doing that. And if you're a resident, it can duly negatively impact you. And so I literally didn't tell anybody what I was doing. And I doubled that with overachieving in residency, getting elected to be chief resident amongst my peers in my class, and never giving anybody the benefit of doubting anything that I was doing. So everything I did was post-call, weekends, after hours, never at the neglect of my clinical commitments, because had I not been successful there, I never would have had the other opportunities that I have. But in order to not suck all the air out of the room, I'm going to take a quick pause and figure out of those which one you want to dig in on.
No, and you're not sucking there. Look, I'm having you on the show because like people want to hear from you, not from me talking. That's why I have my solo pods on Fridays, so people can just have the solos with me. But no, there's so much that you said that resonates with me. Like the first, which I'm sure anytime I say I'm going to piss somebody off, it always happens and I get a message, but it is what it is. But I get that same sense, which is there are people who literally, they went through medical school and they finished, right? And or they did 1 year of residency and they insist on people calling them doctors. Like usually, like I won't mention the person's name, but like a few years ago, I met somebody and it's, oh, hi, it's Dr. Smith. I'm like, oh, where'd you train? Oh, like I just did finish medical school. I'm like, got it. I'm like, so John, because I'm like, I'm not going to call you doctor. You're not a doctor. Sorry, just not gonna. And there's something about medicine. I think that as you ascend in your career, you just have so many times where you're brought back down to zero and humbled that a lot of times, like some of the most humble and down to earth physicians have every right to have a big ego. I'll give you a great example. Larry Lanke, who's a world famous spine surgeon, right? He has techniques named after him. He is one of the greats, and quantitatively you can say that too, because I don't think anybody's trained more residents. I think he keeps account of it. He's up to 104 trained right now, something insane. And the guy's so easy to talk to. He's like, yeah, just call me Larry. Very like down to earth and everything. Meanwhile, like there's people who like barely even finish medical school and they insist on this title. But anyways, that's besides the point. I wonder, I feel like a lot of times the hell that we go through when we're younger shapes us as people. And you mentioned something that I can relate to quite a lot, which is if you were going to do some extracurriculars, you had to work double, triple as hard to make it blatantly obvious how good you are, so nobody questions it. How much do you feel like that's translated over to who you are as a person today?
Yeah, that's a super insightful question, Omar. Before I answer that, just one question. I don't want to paint everybody in this field. I think it is a high minority of people that wouldn't be
but
supportive.
They exist.
They exist, and sometimes they overweigh the others. I would say the great majority of folks, you see them as great humans, and they want to support and lift up. And it's all about timing in those sequences. But so I want to leave that on a positive note, because I think I have so much respect and deference for physicians and everything they do, whether or not they branch out of clinical practice or not. And it's the good humans and the ones that love what they do that will always be good humans. And so I think those are who we've surrounded ourselves with constantly. And I would challenge anybody to constantly do that. But
totally agree with that. But just to hammer home the point, if you barely completed any medical school and you're insisting on people calling you a doctor, I'm not going to call you a doctor. I'll say that. Sure. JJ's a much better human than me on that topic. You're much more forgiving. But yeah, no, on the other question that I had asked, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I love it. It's been a constant part of who I am. And I think it went back, and actually I could trace its origins back. When I was picking my major in college, I remember once again, I was going to be a biology major. And it was, I'm going to go to medical school and be a biology major. And I remember my dad asking a simple question is, listen, let's just say you don't go to medical school. Like, you're going to be a biologist? And I remember thinking like, yeah, probably not. And so he was like, why don't you, get some real world skills? And that sort of pushed me down the path of becoming an economics major. And it made a lot of sense to me, given this inkling of what I was interested in doing. And so it started at that point because economics was completely like asymmetric to all of my pre-med classes. So I finished this huge block of tests in pre-med and everyone would go off and party. And I'd be like, oh man, I'm like just getting into all my econ testing now. And so there was constantly this.
I was like, that econ is not easy either for anybody who's dabbled in it. It's not easy to do.
Yeah. But like the shift from right brain to left brain also was, I think, really healthy. And I literally traced my overlapping layers back to that. And it gave me a sense of always wanting the duality of an education. So understanding the clinical, but the business at the same time, or the left and the right, or the negative and the positive, but holistically understanding things. And as I matriculated that throughout my education and my career, it was replicated in residency and medical school by having the dual path of helping to found and launch and build companies while also completing my clinical training and using that as a feedback loop to myself. I think it made me a better clinician, and it certainly made me a better entrepreneur. And I always thought, wow, like this isn't antagonistic. This is incredibly synergistic. And as I continued to go on, I'll take it all the way forward. I have a really great friend who wrote a Harvard Business Review article about the power of encouraging your executives to have one other alternative inspiration, whether it be sitting on a board. It was actually built around, do you let your executives sit on outside boards? And the answer emphatically was, yeah, because it gives you perspective that only adds to what you're doing for your day job. And so I've always had an interest in educating myself in new areas, contributing to new ideas that were in parallel or even asymmetric to what I was doing for, let's call it my day job, but always tying along multiple things in fashion. I think since college, I've never just done one thing. And I probably carry that into my personal life as well. I'm like the vacationer that likes to be super active. orthogonal.
I think,
But I think some others in my family, they're like, let's just chill.
it's funny you say that. And maybe this is probably why, because the first time you and I talked, we hit it off and had a great conversation. Very much the same way. And I feel that I think I think I picked this up from medicine, because as you notice, physicians in medicine, they have these outside hobbies and they really go deep in them. If they're a fly fisher, they really know a lot about fly fishing. If they're into history, they go deep in history. Right. And I think it enriches, because medicine's really big on this, which is getting ideas outside of medicine and bringing it back in. Checklist Manifesto is a best-selling book and this like huge thing in medicine, but like checklists have been around for a long time. But I think there's something to be said about that, not just in medicine, but just in your career, which is like, for me, it's like going back to what you mentioned about being a resident and everything. And by the way, this is the beauty about this podcast. It really feels like people are hanging out with us at home, because my kid's losing his mind in the background. Can you hear that?
I'm so empathetic to that. I got 4 little kiddos. So
I know,
we just
I appreciate that.
we roll through it.
Yeah, we'll roll through it, man.
I can't hear it, by the way. So you're all
great.
good.
Great. No, so I was saying, like, when I was earlier in my career, while I was a marketing manager, I was trying to do other things, learn how to become a great writer, everything. But in doing that, I was like, I had this belief, it's a psychological belief about an industry. Once it gets very good at selling to a certain customer, they become that customer. So just how medicine is very like hierarchical, and there's a sense of like ownership and like, why are you doing that? The same thing happens in med device. So like, you could be killing it in your job, but if you do this one thing on the weekend that's a little bit public, a lot of times your company's, oh, why are you doing these extra things? And this is going to conflict with work. So I had to kill myself to be undeniably good at what I did. And part of that is going outside of like marketing and sales and like learning more about history. How is propaganda used? All these things. And I think that encouraging those kind of things, especially for executives to go outside of the company, go sit on independent boards and everything, I think is like the best thing you can do for a company, because you're now bringing ideas that you may not have ever thought of and combining them to make better things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just underscore, I think you earn that. I think excellence begets excellence. And if you are succeeding and earning your right to do that, I wholeheartedly agree. I think what you want to avoid is a lot of mediocrity across the board. And I found that in my clinical training or professional life thereafter, if you demonstrated excellence and people had complete faith in you and you delivered, you didn't leave anyone hanging, it gave you the right, you earned the right to be able to mature and explore other avenues, assuming that you continue that course of excellence along the way. I think if you ever see yourself not achieving that excellence, then you have to make a decision and you have to step away. And for me, several years into my practice, I found myself traveling 90% of the time, and not like to Nevada and Arizona, but like to Shanghai and Belgium and all these locations. And I would come back and take a call. And I just remember one night thinking, I'm not doing justice to this patient, and I'm not doing justice to myself. And I can't continue to keep the duality of being on faculty at Stanford and providing clinical medicine and also running a large global organization. It just doesn't make sense anymore to do that. And you have to take the high road in those situations. And that's actually when I stepped away from medicine. It was about 5 or 6 years into clinical practice. I only ever ended up being part-time. When I graduated residency, it was actually the same month that we were taking our company public at the time. And I remember nobody knew what I did until literally the last month of residency. And we were filling out, like, for graduation night, it's okay, what fellowship are you going to? And I had just the best class of residents. My colleagues were and are remarkable people. And 99% of the teaching staff at Stanford and my mentors were and are remarkable people. But the one or two that just, let's call them not great humans, when they found out, man, it was like the world flipped. And I exited with a little bit of a bad taste.
I've met those people before.
Yeah, I exited with a little bit of a bad taste, and I just overcame it by giving back. So I would come and teach the residents about entrepreneurship. And the program director at that time had asked me to come do it. And I got dozens of emails after that. And I think there's always challenges. I think if you are able to overcome them through data or relationships or experience thereafter, all the better. I don't think you have to feel the need to change these people, but if you can change their perceptions in the future by just the goodness that you do, great outcome. I think that those are lessons learned for me. And I remember they got up and they read like what I was doing at graduation, and everyone just was like, what? You got to take the high road at each stance and make sure that you're just always delivering excellence. And you just can't go wrong if that's your path.
And I think that really is a skill. Like I have a lot of young people who listen to the show, both in the industry and outside of it. And one of the questions I always ask is, how can you develop a great career and everything? And I was like, being coachable is one thing, but the other thing is like being known as the kind of person that's like, when you say you're going to do something, you deliver every single time. I'm like, that's a good reputation to develop. You reminded me of a story I heard a while back. Are you familiar with Seth Godin?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Seth Godin, I don't know, he's some like 18 or 19 best-selling books, prolific marketer, father of permission marketing. He was talking to Zig Ziglar, who's like a famous motivational speaker and seller. And so Seth asked Zig, he's like, hey Zig, when you give these talks publicly, what do you do? Like, how does it not bother you if you're there and there's a guy who's asleep in the audience or is just not happy and everything? And Zig had this really good piece of advice, which I've taken to heart. Because it's hard. I think psychologically as human beings, we're wired to look for the negative. And so we put our attention there. And Zig's advice is like really good. And remind me what you're saying, which is, he's like, it's not for them. That's not the person you should be focused on. You should be focused on the lady who's in the front row who got a babysitter for the night, drove all the way, and she's listening to every word you're saying. And those are the people you have to pay attention to. And I think that as humans, like when we create great work and everything, it's very easy to get swept up with the one or two people who are naysayers, who are criticizing, and then we forget about all the people who are making like some kind of impact on them, whether they're junior employees or residents or anything else. Yeah. Dad advice, right? I'm practicing for now.
I love dad advice coming from one dad to the other. We can tell our kids who like like, great advice, Dad. Yeah.
Like I had a book show on YouTube for 3 years where essentially I did a book review every week. It was called Mind Loom. So the idea was like review a book, but then relate it to other books. And when I'm out of town, like my wife turns on the TV and puts those on and my kid watches them. And I told her, I was like, what you don't know is that I actually had a plan all this time. I'm not going to raise the kid. I'm just going to have him watch YouTube videos of me talking about different concepts. So I'll be good. When you entered your career as a Medtech entrepreneur, in my opinion, okay, because I like to read things like you're calling a sport, like athletes and stuff. So when I look at your career, you're at Incline Therapeutics. I think JJ Desai became JJ Desai in Medtech at Avenger. That's my personal opinion. I think that's where it started. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think
and just to get to the punchline of that, I want you to dive into that a little bit. You started off as the director of medical affairs and market development, and then you leapfrogged and became the chief medical officer, and you remained there for 5 years, which is not something small at all. That's a huge responsibility. And Avenger has a very well-known and very respected founder as well. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that time at Avenger.
Yeah, this was really...
And it's a John Simpson company, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Okay, I want to make sure I was thinking the right one.
And it's a critical... This really goes back to one of the core influences in my life, which were mentors. And mentors, first and foremost, were always just exceptional humans. And when I looked at them beyond their sort of success, whether it be financial, clinical, industrial, entrepreneurial, otherwise, it was, man, I just want to be as great of a human as this person. And I think there's probably no one stronger I can say that about than John Simpson. And I had like just the true privilege of meeting John through his son, JD, who remains a very dear friend of mine. And it was literally as I was literally starting residency, and I was in my mode of cold calling hundreds of people and talking about experiences with different companies in the Bay Area. And I drove up to the Woodside Bakery and I met JD, and I remember I was wearing a tie and all these great things. And he said, "Hey, nice tie," and took the tie off.
It reminds me of the Animal House scene when they're like, "Oh, look at this tie. Hey, come look at this tie, guys."
Yeah, right. And I walked into the Woodside Bakery and everyone was in t-shirts and vests and whatever else. And so I thought to myself, I was like, okay, registered. We sat there and he said, okay, he's like, what are you doing tomorrow? I was like, I'm a resident. I don't really get a lot of flexibility in this stuff. He's like, let's meet tomorrow with my dad, and we're starting a new company. And I think you're going to love it and you can add a lot of value and be a huge part of it. And so I see the forethought and the ability for other people to see somebody and see what they can be great in. as an unbelievable talent. And it's one that John has and many other people that I've stayed close with in my life. But he was coming off the heels of having sold Fox Hollow at that time and really inventing a new therapy in cardiovascular medicine. And then trying to do it even better by saying, hey, let's not use a bunch of two-dimensional x-ray. Let's use three-dimensional optics and really only take out the disease and not damage and create all this profound inflammation in our arteries by destroying them through mechanisms that he had created before with balloon angioplasty and other things. Medicine is never perfect, right? Something we're doing today, we will stop doing in 10 years because we realize it was a temporary fix, but not the right fix ultimately. And so John has this voracious thirst for continual iteration of betterment based off of what he did. And in that process, I literally started and I said, I will donate my time. I will go and write health economics outcomes data because once again, I was an economist. I had done operating room management research, right? I just went to what I knew and I showed up literally every post call, every day that I finished. I went to the offices in Redwood City and I sat with the 4 people at the time starting the company. And slowly it was 12 people, then 24 people, then 100 people. And the manufacturing developed and clinical trials went on. And I just learned organically. And if there's one piece of advice I could ever offer, it's to just show up. You have no idea how much of a difference in my life just showing up. Even in times I'm like, oh, do I really want to go to this? And you show up and it's just about the human connection you make with people when you show up that will never supplant an email or a call or something else. You just never move as far in life as you do through that. And so developing an acumen for the sort of development side, understanding how to build a market, understanding how to build a medical infrastructure around that, understanding how to pair it with commercialization, reimbursement, value and access, company growth, investment, multiple private series rounds, public round, eventual like series of acquisition discussions. Those were invaluable to me. And John, to his credit, at every point included me, even when I was like this super novice person in the room, included me. And I remember it just had such a profound impact. I was like, why is this guy who's so successful and has done so much, like calling me and including me? And it really became a true friendship where I've had the benefit of all of my colleagues. I can call them friends. I'm sorry, all of my mentors, I can call them colleagues and friends. I still have the deference of mentorship to that relationship, but these are just great humans. And so I did that all throughout residency. And as I said, we were taking that company public as I finished residency. And it led to the next evolution of jumping to a much larger global workplace to look at medicine from the other side of the curtain to some extent, but always with the ideals that John and my whole team at Avenger instilled in me. And on our board were folks like Tom Fogarty and early investors in Silicon Valley. And it's the first time that I got to meet Fred Moll, who's since become a friend and a co-investor on a lot of different companies together. And it's that archetype of the spider web that grows and grows and grows. But the bigger the world gets and the more people you meet, you realize how small everything goes back to that connected network. Just can't thank John Simpson enough, really, for being an exceptional human first and foremost, and then everything else that followed in his contributions to clinical medicine.
Yeah, he really is an exceptional human being. I was just checking it. So I met him a long time ago, not that long, but like back in 2019. I actually wrote an article called if anybody's interested, you can Google Startup Pearls from Dr. Simpson, father of interventional cardiology. And just for the listeners who are hearing this, I just want them to know like a little context in terms of like his track record. He uses some of the companies that he started and the result of them. So ACS and DVI, both acquired by Eli Lilly, CVIS acquired by Boston Scientific, Perclose, which sold to Abbott, Lumen, which sold to Cordis, and then Fox Hollow, which was acquired by EV3, which is now part of Medtronic. So it's just like insane. And the guy, West Texas guy like me. And so like when I first met him, I was like, got some boots on, but extremely approachable, super sharp guy. And it's funny, like they're obviously very different. It was the same kind of feeling I had when I talked to Chris Dewey, which is like super accomplished, but the most approachable person. Like I felt very comfortable talking. I feel like they're surrogate uncles or granddads for me. Like they're just really great people, and the kind of people that like from the moment you meet them, you feel like very comfortable as a professional to ask them the questions you want to ask and not worry about, oh, am I asking the right question, or what are they going to think if I ask this question or not?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Chris Dewey and John Simpson are cut from the same thread. And
Totally.
I had to say what that is. Being a great human is the primary, but the relationship aspect, they like to develop deep relationships and authentic relationships. And I think that goes a really long way when things are going well. And it goes even longer when things aren't going well, because you really have trust and confidence that the person beside you is thinking about the best thing possible for whatever the situation is. And I'll go back to one story John told me that resonated so much about just the impact you can make through relationships. And this is the story of how Perclose started. And hopefully I tell this right from my memory, but him and Tom Fogarty were colleagues together at Stanford. And John was the interventional cardiology fellow, and Tom was on the surgical side. And everyone was going to get coffee afterwards, but the job of the fellow was to hold pressure on the femoral artery, which is where the access point was. And if you've ever held pressure on a femoral artery, like you got to do it for 20 minutes. In anesthesia training, I found that more often than not if I thought I was done and spurted it up. And Tom just walked in and said, "John, you're going to come get coffee." And I said, "No, I'm doing this." And as John told me it, he said, he just looked over and he goes, "I could just throw a stitch in that and we can get out of here and go get some coffee." And he was just, that was like, that's how closure was born, like in that conversation over just like a logical solution to something that otherwise people were okay bleeding, no pun intended, 20 minutes of their time to manually pressure close. So it's the experiences like that. If I'm in a tough situation, I ask myself, hey, if I was back in that situation, what would this look like logically?
Yeah, I think that's when I think of people like Dewey or Fred Mall, John Simpson. One of the things that I try and take away is like first principle thinking, and I think that's one of the values of if you're able to talk to somebody like that, or if you're lucky enough to shadow them, which is to see like how do they make decisions and that how do they think about things. And so I'm wondering in your time, again, like I think Avenger was sort of, if you think about like the pyramids, I'm obsessed with ancient Egypt and the pyramids and everything. I'm just starting to learn more about the history. When I look at those pyramids, it's so impressive because that base is just such a solid foundation. So for you, I feel like, again, going back to the Avenger, like that was like that first solid foundation for you in the medtech world. I'm wondering if you go back, it doesn't have to be Dr. Simpson, but what was the most painful thing somebody ever told you that made you change for the better?
Wow. I can really go back and to like one of the moments of my life where it was swim team when I was growing up. I remember thinking like I was just an awesome swimmer in my own little right. And when I went out to like actually go join swim team, and this was like at an Olympic facility in Southern California, Nova Aquatics, and I remember I got out and the coach, who didn't know me, was like, "You're a pretty terrible swimmer." And I was like a young kid at the time. And I remember thinking like, wow, like blasted. And it was so against what I had in my own perception of myself. And it sucked like to hear it to where I was like, I'm giving up. I'm out, right? If the perception of this person is so different to me, I'm out. And I remember it was a struggle. And my parents were, "No, we think you should go get formal swim lessons." And I remember thinking, no way, like I'm out of this. If I'm not naturally gifted, I'm not going to do it. And I struggled my way through those swim lessons to the point where like I got 3 of the 4 strokes and I just couldn't get a 4th stroke. And they were like, "Listen, we want to move you on, but we're going to fail you again because you haven't mastered this 4th stroke." And I was just like, what am I supposed to do here? Fast forward, like swimming and water polo are my, like the 2 things that define my youth and that I love. And I still do 4 or 5 days a week. And so I remember like viscerally that being painful, but I also remember in residency finishing last in like an inborn standardized test, and not because I wasn't prepared. It's just the way the domino falls on something and meeting and saying, "Hey, like you really sucked at this." And it's the way something's delivered, but then it's an inflected on what are you going to do about it? And so I think what I've taken it, and when I try to coach it back to myself or coach it with my children or others, is be brutally honest, right? Like you're doing no service to anybody by sugarcoating something. There's a refreshing nature of being brutally honest with people. And I think it's on the person. It was on me in those instances where I reacted that way because I wasn't open to honesty. And the more I got comfortable with understanding that honesty in its most brutal form is such a gift, that it allowed me to figure out, okay, that's really helpful. Now, how do I go about and do this? And as I'm trying to give brutal honesty to folks, I always try to figure out the and what, if I can be helpful in it. Or sometimes you got to let it rest and come back to it if it's too brutal in some instances. Those are maybe two tangential experiences I had that maybe reflected to your question.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think what's interesting is I completely agree. And again, this is why I was excited to talk to you, just because sharing like somewhat similar like backgrounds, haven't been in medicine. Again, I left medical school halfway through, so I didn't finish doing that and going into the startup world. The interesting thing is, as I get older, what I realize is that some of these lessons, like for example, being really open to feedback and then really reflecting hard and being like, grade yourself harder than others. I don't believe in like balance, work-life balance. Like I feel like there's always going to be some imbalance, but I think the biggest thing is to look for some harmony, which is like who I am at home with my son and my wife is pretty much the same person that I am at work and with companies and et cetera. And I think part of it is just like this constant refinement as an entrepreneur, which is like how good are you at recognizing that there's a lesson to be learned? And then how fast are you on taking action on iterating on that lesson? I think is like one of the more important things. I think just as a human being, but also as a startup, as an entrepreneur in this world.
Yeah, I'm still working on it. I'm still trying to get better. I used to suck at it. And I'll say there's a couple things. I do a lot of personal work on it, and both existential in nature and reading and practicing, and also really entrusting in my friends that I love dearly, that I ask for constant feedback and I share feedback with. And one of the strongest things that ever happened to me is I joined a group called YPO, and I have a forum in YPO. And the whole purpose of forum is to like check yourself at the door and be open to just the rawest form of feedback and support that you can, and be honest in a way that sometimes you can't with your family, sometimes you can't with your colleagues, but with that group. And so I've really made it an important part of myself to constantly understand what I don't know, or realize that I still need a lot of help at these things, and try to surround myself with the tools to do it. And I remember at the point of traveling so extensively when I was finishing my time at Johnson & Johnson, and I was just like showing up so mediocre on all levels, as a husband, as a father, present at home, present at work. Like I was just doing so much stuff. And I remember thinking like, who am I benefiting here? I'm definitely not benefiting myself. I'm like this level of excellence that I hold myself to, I can see dents in the armor. And it was just making the final decision to be like, I got to just, pull the ripcord on this and like reset to some extent and go back to building the things that I love, where it was not easy. It was incredibly hard to do that, but it was so refreshing. And I just showed up so different, in such a different way. And I realized that it's a work in progress. Like I constantly find ways that I can show up better. I try to go back and acknowledge them and ask for feedback on them, but then make sure that I don't repeat. And I found that I've made a lot of progress in areas, and I know I have a lot more progress to still make. But I couldn't underscore that enough. It's a continual learning journey for me.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. And I wonder, I think this will resonate with you. When I was in medical school, there's a really fascinating book on residency and everything. It's called Iserson's something. And one of the things that book said that I didn't understand until I was in medical school was that you don't really pick your residency based on your interests or like whatever. You really pick your residency based on your personality, right? And then in the world of medtech, there's like different levels of companies, but for me, there's just big established companies, maybe some mid caps or startups. It's like those two worlds. And I feel like you end up in one or the other really based on your personality. And so for you, you're at a high executive level at J, and you're there for just a little under 2 years. And so I'm wondering during that time, because we know these people, we've met people like this who they're either at a large company and really they should be in a startup, or they're in a startup and they should be at a large company, but they perpetuate this for a variety of reasons, mainly ego driven, right? Pressure from society, family, whatever, that has that influence. I'm wondering what exactly, if you can go back, what was the emotion you felt specifically that made you change your behavior and say, you know what, I don't think I'm in the place that I should be?
It's a great example for me. And I'll start by saying that the people I met and the time I spent at Jay, my exposure to that element of healthcare was awesome. And I have the highest form of respect for the company, the mission, the credo, if you're familiar with it. It's all true. It's all very genuine. It's all very authentic. And I think J&J has and will continue to make a huge difference in the lives of patients and their families. I was really inspired actually by one individual. I had shown up. This just cracks me up. I got really involved with biodesign at Stanford. I called up Paul Yock and I said, I really want to get engaged here. Like, I'm in this community. I clinically was here. I helped start this company. And Paul, once again, great human, said, let's do it. And started helping to teach a course looking at kind of a 2.0 version of global value and access and reimbursement as it pertained to digital and medical devices. Biodesign was just like, for the first time ever, people were picking digital technology programs rather than traditional device at this time. And some amazing people that built that program. And Texas Medical Center was starting their own biodesign program. And I remember thinking, like, that's pretty cool. And the more you dig into Texas Medical Center, you realize, wow, this is an amazing institution. And so I literally, on my own dime, I called them up and I said, I'm an advisor and I teach about design at Stanford. Here's my background. I would love to come and just come to your advisor day at Biodesign Texas Medical Center. And they were arms wide open, which was awesome. And I showed up and I was really blown away. I walked into this old Nabisco cookie factory and to the TMC there. And I sat with the folks at the time. And actually, there was the former president and CEO of the Texas Medical Center, Bobby, had come from Stanford. And he was a CT surgeon. And he'd come from Stanford. And he really changed the entire way that the Texas Medical Center was approaching innovation and just as a business model. And he brought along with him Bill McKean, who's the current CEO and also phenomenal and was a Stanford pull through. And I'm meeting these companies. And I remember thinking, like, these are pretty early companies. This is like an early nascent ecosystem, but like they're totally onto something here. And in my last meeting of the day, I think I'd been with 11 companies, just rapid fire. The door kicks open and there's this gregarious individual in a tailored suit and cowboy boots. And this is like a theme between John Simpson and now Billy Cohn, who kicked open the door. And he goes, who's this Stanford guy in here? And I was like, who is this guy? And he sits down and we like have a bromance, like in front of this company for the first time ever meeting. And we just talk to each other for 30 minutes while also giving feedback to this company. I remember thinking, like, what that company must have thought at that time. And I'd never met Billy. I actually really didn't even know much about Billy at that time. And I have an Uber waiting outside to go back and fly back home and go back to work. And he's like, hey, let me show you something. And he pulls me over to this huge open space. It was not built out at all. It was this old cookie factory floor. And he said, this is the future of innovation in medical devices. And I was just like, man, I don't know who you are or what you smoked this morning, but this is crazy. And he said, J&J is building the Center for Device Innovation and I'm going to run it. And I looked at him, I'm like, you're going to go work for J&J? And he goes, I already do. I remember thinking, like, what is going on here? And I remember sitting in the cab and he's just waving on the side of the thing. And lo and behold, man, he planted a seed. And a couple months later, I left Avenger to take a position that involved both the JLabs ecosystem and the Center for Device Innovation. And Billy was like my closest sort of colleague, collaborator, and mentor. Like, I call him a collaborator and a colleague and a friend, and he really is a dear friend. But Billy, in so many ways, was such a mentor to me in his like pure tenacity, unadulterated curiosity, and just could give an F about what other people think about him because he's an unbelievable human. And all to boot, he's like the best magician I've ever met. And so Billy really reignited the spark for me of what it could be. And through my time at J&J, I got to really think about big topics and like huge views of things. But the more that I did that, the more I got away from like the core of innovation, building companies, building early shots on goal, really understanding what was going to disrupt and bring true change. And I was spending a lot more time with like HR, building teams or like speaking at big conferences or like trying to establish a new center somewhere. And I remember somebody saying, man, you got it really good. Just hold out until your pension kicks in at 55. And I was like, man, I'm 30. Are you kidding me? Like, I'm not here for the pension. And it became clear, like, when what I loved doing and what I was doing became so disparate. And once again, I felt like really conflicted about it because it was so, I made it. Like, I minted it, like golden handcuffs, a lot of money, a lot of equity, big, audacious opportunities, unbelievable people I get to work with. But at the end of the day, I remember sitting with my wife and saying, I think it's really like time to shift gears. And she was like, yeah, 100%. Do what's going to make you happy because it's going to be the best version of yourself when we're together as well. And I remember that was like the thought process of moving out and starting my role at Insightec. And like, to true form, Billy and I never lost touch. And even since then, we're thick as thieves and do a lot together. Some very exciting stuff that you'll hear more and more about that's making a pretty big difference here. Company building, mentorship, investing. I think the world of him. He's the next generation. I remember I was giving a talk at a conference in Napa, and I had Billy and John Simpson in the room together. And it was the first and I think only time since then, multiple times we got back together. And I put a slide up of the goofiest pictures I had of both of them. And amazing. I remember, and the slide was like, this is the only thing that matters. And I remember like getting semi-emotional on stage talking about it, but there's people that just impact your life in ways you can't understand. And I remember going back, like the just show up mentality. Had I never just showed up to TMC just out of curiosity and wanting to figure out if there was a better way to do things, I never would have met Billy Cohn. Maybe I would have met Billy Cohn, but never in the way that changed my life. And he's still just one of my closest friends and just the wildest man I know, but like in all the right ways.
That I love that. That's amazing. It's like hearing stuff like that. That's part of the reason why I started this podcast, is all these like amazing stories of great individuals, how they got connected. Just like a quick side note. And again, I hesitate to say this, but I have to share it. So one, you're going to help me get Bill Cohn on this show, because I've been he's another character in the industry that I keep hearing about. I'm like,
highest rated show of all time. I've no doubt about that.
Okay. This is controversial. I think it's controversial. I don't know. I have this kind of metaphysical filter on life sometimes, and it doesn't help that there's all these wild books that I read in my library. So when I hear of Billy Cohn, so he's a just for the audience, he's based in Texas. He's a cardiothoracic surgeon, and he has a teaching position at Baylor, correct?
Yeah,
okay.
Texas Heart Institute. Yeah, probably way more things than what we're mentioning, but yes.
Yeah, a lot more things. So to some extent, I believe in simulation theory, that like we live in a computer simulation some way, and there's like code reuse. So that's a whole other topic. Okay. There's some like non-coincidental things that happen in life. So when I hear of Billy Cohn, all the stories I've heard of, and then that he's in Texas, he's a cardiothoracic surgeon, what comes to mind are two of the most historic names in cardiothoracic surgery, which is Denton Cooley and Dr. Michael DeBakey, who in history, there's a wild time in medicine where one of my favorite, actually here, I'll pull it up later, but there's a Life magazine cover where it shows both of them. And the title, I'll read it a bitter feud, two great surgeons at war over the human heart. So the reason why I mentioned that, on one side, you have Dr. DeBakey, which, not my words, but anybody who I've talked to, including people who trained in him, were like, yeah, the guy's kind of a jerk. He like does not care, etc. He's super aggressive, super competitive, blah, blah. On the other side, you have Denton Cooley, who people were like, yeah, he's like Dr. Wonderful. And these guys competed against each other, like literally within like less than a mile apart in Texas.
Yep.
And they are no longer here. I have this belief that there's some code reuse where Billy Cohn is like the best of both worlds, and you have this like larger than life, extremely talented individual where, at least the stories I've heard, super competitive, go-getter, all these things, really direct, but also a guy that you just fall in love with because of the way his personality is and everything. And so hearing this, I just had to share that, because and I could be wrong about it, but I'm like, man, I feel like that's what happens in the war, in this like life we live in, which is you have these two great surgeons, they pass away. What's the next iteration? It's like the best of both worlds combined into one person. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great preview for your segment with Billy, because Billy, and I I don't know exactly, so I might be mixing names here, but I'm pretty sure Billy was like one of the last fellows of DeBakey and was a pallbearer at his funeral. And he has this amazing picture where one of his innovative surgeries that he was doing, they've been working on the total artificial heart for a very long time. And Billy is now the co-CMO of one of the companies that we helped start together, and another company that's, I think, going to solve the total artificial heart for the first time ever. But he's got this amazing picture where for the first time after however many decades of feuding, they were both in the same operating room. And it was because of Billy. And Billy was doing this innovative surgery, and he brought them both together in person back for the first time.
I never heard of that. I knew they eventually made up and called it a truce. I didn't hear about that story about the OR. That's insane. I want to see that photo.
Yeah, he's got this picture. And yeah, the gravity of some people have a gravity about them, whether you call it a magnetism or a gravity. Billy has that.
That's amazing. Yeah. He's got to come on the show. Don't show him this episode because I don't know, like that analogy that just came up, if it'll land with him or not. But
if it doesn't, he'll tell you.
So. Got it. That's amazing. Just pivot real quick. I want to make sure like we do talk about it. Originally, when I reached out to you, it's mainly, so I love all the companies that are in the industry. But I will say I have some preference, and Insightec is one of those companies because what I love about our industry is we're doing things that are literally, no offense to anybody, but if the world of fintech doesn't receive any more financing, like people aren't going to die. And so like last year we had a down year in funding in Medtech. And like when I see something like that, I think of, wow, like patients are going to suffer as a result of that. So that all to say, Insightec is one of those Medtech companies where literally what you guys do is like magic to me. Literally like magic. And you can talk about what Insightec does and how you ended up over there. I would love to hear it.
Yeah. Insightec is the most special company I've ever had a privilege to be a part of. And it's because it fundamentally changes lives. And it does it in such a unique way that speaks to all of the points of innovation. And it's going to do so much more. And the line of focused ultrasound in care will be a complete vertical in medicine. I have no doubts about that. Think how you think about surgery or radiation, you will think about focused ultrasound for all parts of the body. And I just have the privilege of being able to work on the organ of the century, the brain, for all of the reasons that the engineers at Insightec work so hard to have huge advancements in technology. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I came to Insightec through this sort of just show up and great human narrative, which keeps following me in life. And the 2 points of inference, well, really 3 points of inference. I'll get to the third one, which is geographical. But we were looking at J&J about how to get neurodegenerative drugs across the brain. And one of the beautiful powers of J&J was that it had this big device business, the big pharma business, and at that time, a big consumer business as well. And it was like the one steadying point of J&J in the markets where if one business was down, the other would carry it through. Historically, you're seeing a little bit of a shift now in J&J and spinning out Kenvue and the consumer, and maybe in the future splitting med and pharma. Who knows? I don't have any predictions there. But we were looking at ways you could get therapeutics into the brain for neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's. And focused ultrasound was this like concept. And I remember I showed up in an exploratory fashion to the Focused Ultrasound Foundation Symposium. And there was a foundation created by a gentleman named Neil Cassell, who, once again, is just an unbelievable human and advancing care beyond what one man should ever do, but is bringing forward like an entire body of medicine. And that could be a whole nother podcast for you with Neil. But
I'd love to have him on.
Yeah, I was blown away. I went to this little conference room in Virginia in this hotel, nondescript, like not a big medtech conference, not a big academic conference. And I saw a decade's worth of basic and translational science, and then clinical evidence, and then the first impending clinical approvals. And I remember thinking like, I've never even heard of this. What is all this stuff? And I went back to Stanford and they had 5 systems and a science lab that was being funded by work with Insightec. And I saw my first patient with Dr. Peggy Ganuni. And I remember looking around the MR suite and I was like, did everyone else just see what happened? And I thought to myself, this is going to change the world. And I went along my merry way. And at that time I had moved from the Bay Area to Miami, which doesn't seem like the most logical move if you're thinking about innovation. but it was the most logical move in the sense that it was where my wife was from. And we had two little kiddos, both born in room number 1 at Lucile Packard Hospital. And my wife is not only much smarter than I, but a brilliant physician, a cardiac anesthesiologist. And she's got an unbelievable family and support network. And it was something that allowed her to be the best at what she wanted to do and allowed me to be the best at what I want to do with an unbelievable support around us. So we moved to Miami, and personally, it took me a couple of years to figure out. I remember thinking like, oh my God, we're leaving the best place on earth with all this innovation. And really it was the forethought of my wife that thought about how this was going to play out. And for that, I'm forever grateful. But at that time, I didn't really know too many people in Miami. And I had re-explored the healthcare ecosystem. And there's just once again, a great human, a guy named Christian Seal, who got the Knight Foundation to give him a couple $1 million, came down from Harvard Business School and created an accelerator, an incubator around healthcare. And I showed up and said, there's not a whole lot going on here, but apparently you guys are the only thing going on. And I instantly found that same spark that you could feel in the Bay Area, in Palo Alto and in Menlo and up into the peninsula. And I remember thinking like, wow, these guys are really onto something. And they're super smart, very bright. And we're making big differences and investing and building companies. And Christian sat across the room from me. And I forget, I think he was called the like head of hustle. That was like his title on his door. It's very apropos for him as well. And he said, I'm going to introduce you to the guy that's going to change your life. And I remember thinking like, okay, whatever that means. And he said, you got to go meet a guy named Maurice Ferre. And I said, okay, like I trust people that know me, that make introductions. It's like the best way to navigate life. And I remember my first meeting with Maurice. We had a coffee at this great little Argentinian bistro place. And it was one of those, once again, it was like the first meeting with me and Billy and the first meeting with me and John Simpson. It was like, wow, we're going to do some stuff together in life. And it was just instant ease and instant fun and instant like greatness. And then I found out that he was like the chairman and CEO of Insightec. And I said, this is in Miami? And I was coordinating to bring my J&J teams to come meet with Insightec. And I remember it, like the whole world was like this to me. And so I found once again another great human who had an unbelievable mentorship mentality to him, but has become an unbelievable friend and colleague. I found a brilliant company, an opportunity to do all of it with my family in Miami, and all of these points of connection in the universe. And it was at that point I called Maurice and I said, hey, I want to come do something really big here with you. And he said, I don't know exactly what it's going to be or what your title is going to be, but let's do it. And we did it. And that was almost 6 years ago now. And Insightec had just started getting its approvals. To take a step back, Insightec delivers focused ultrasound. And ultrasound that a mother uses a sonographer to look at a baby that's developing in her womb. Ultrasound has waves. Those waves hit something, they reflect back, and you can use the differential in that to create an image. You can also use the waves to converge and be therapeutic. And Insightec was and is the world's leader in this. Amazing scientists, originally born out of GE with a high confluence of Technion University PhDs. And it created a way to focus energy through your skull, which instantly wants to refract it. It wants to scatter it, but refocus it, take it into your brain to deep structures and create a therapeutic endpoint by using a bunch of different modalities. If you use high frequency, you create a pinpoint ablation, much like a child with a magnifying glass harnessing the rays of the sun down to a leaf. If you do a broad-based three-dimensional, you can open the blood-brain barrier and pair it with therapies to go into the brain, which is probably the largest problem in neurosciences. Or if you simply deliver a low-frequency energy to an area of the brain that electrochemically is off, you can modulate it and change things like addictive pattern behaviors. And the brilliance of this is that you can't feel sound. It doesn't require incisions. It doesn't require implantables. It doesn't require anesthesia. And it's immediate, its effect. And so the first patient I saw was an essential tremor patient who had been disabled for 20, 30 years. Severe disablement, can't text, can't write their name, can't drink a cup of tea. And on the table as they look at precision imaging, dial in on the area of the thalamus that needs to be treated, deliver harmonic energy, measure it, test it, feel it, and boom, hand goes dead steady. And you've been in medicine, I've been in medicine. There's nothing in medicine that is instant like that from a gratification perspective. And the room is instant elation and emotion all at the same time. Like people are crying. It's dramatic. And I cry at rom-coms. So just imagine you're in this room, I just lose it and happy. And so if I have to tailor it down, it uses the best of precision medicine in every way. Precision imaging, precision therapy. It's non-ionizing. There's no radiation effect to it, and precision outcomes. And it's tailored. Your therapy is tailored from my therapy is tailored from the next person's therapy. And I remember thinking, this is literally going to change how we approach neuroscience. And it has, and it continues to. And it's an unbelievable company to work with and for.
Yeah, and I'm gonna share my screen just for the people who are watching on Spotify and YouTube, just to see this, because again, it's incisionless brain surgery, neurosurgery, and the effects and the whole journey fits in the YouTube short. So there's one YouTube short, there's many of them, of patient before and patient after, and it's when I tell people about Insightec, I'm like, it's like magic. That's not hyperbole, literally like magic. Let me bring up this clip. Yeah, let me restart this. Okay, so here's a patient, okay, has had essential tremor for 30 years, goes into the MRI. They use Insightec technology, okay? Now they're going to show the after, and this is all in the same day. So there's before, for him to draw straight lines and spirals and everything, and after, steady hand, his life. This guy, and he looks like a pretty young guy. His life has changed. Look, he's walking perfectly fine. And then this is the best part. I'm getting tense just describing this. Here he's about to cut a cake. He's holding a knife. He's not shaking. He's just so happy.
Yeah.
I don't know, that.
You learn it's the little things. First, I'll compliment Dr. Munyon and Novant Health. It shows the power of this. Novant being a community-based, Carolina-based network. This started in the halls of academic power, Harvard and Stanford, and now HCA is an adopter, community hospitals. Access is such an important part of technology. You have to be able to do something that could reach everybody, not just a select few. And that really is the power of this. And you speak to the point of the little things. And one of the most impactful patients for me is this woman, Carol Klein. And we have a beautiful video of her. And I remember when I first sat down with her, she said, I just want to be able to bake a cake again. Baking a cake for me and my husband brings me so much joy. And she taught at missionary school, and she would write letters to her students, and she couldn't do that. And it wasn't anything major. It was these. And then as we started talking, she said, I don't go to the grocery store anymore because I can't reach up to things that aren't at my level. And I certainly don't go to restaurants with my friends. And I just pretty much sit at home, and I'm pretty sad about it. And she Googled us and showed up. Once again, she showed up, and we have this video where she's just crying, and she's telling her husband, the rest of our lives are going to be normal. And it's unbelievable. And she's actually coming back now in March to get the second side treated. And this is one of the beauties of the precision of focused ultrasound. No non-invasive therapies previously have been safe enough to do both sides of the brain. And we got FDA approvals a few years ago of being able to treat both sides. And so we always treat the dominant side first, but going back and truly giving people just profound stability. So we live our experiences in innovation one patient at a time. And the privilege to treat just one patient is unbelievable, but the privilege to treat tens of thousands and millions of patients, that's that macro effect that I was looking for 20 years ago when I was making all those cold calls. So it's one Carol Klein at a time is pretty unbelievable.
Yeah, and something it came as a result of last year's funding environment. For me, my other side of my business, I work with startups to commercialize their products using social media, but the other side is to raise money, and it's been tough. One of the goals that I have with my show is I want to raise awareness on a global level with private, wealthy investors, individuals, family offices, and to say, hey, when you invest in a med tech company, you may not be able to expect like a 50x return like you would with like tech or software or something. But you can take a lot of pride in that your family's legacy funded like a life-saving technology. And hearing these stories are just unbelievable. And I think we take it for granted, especially for people who are younger, healthy, just being able to go like just do something normal, right? Like how important that is. There is man, I'm getting like just tight chest and thinking about it. There's a meme or cartoon that showed like a guy like in a car driving, and he was like thinking about something, and it showed, who was it? It was a guy on a bicycle saying, man, I wish I could be like that guy. He's got a car. And then the guy on the bicycle, there's a guy at a bus stop looking at the guy on a bicycle saying, man, I wish I was that guy. I wish I had a bicycle. And then the end of the cartoon showed like a woman who's she's in a wheelchair, and she's up in her apartment looking down, and she's, wow, I wish I can be that guy. He can go anywhere. And we just I think a lot of like normal things we do just take for granted. And the fact that you're able to give back these patients like a normal life is a big deal.
It's a privilege and a responsibility, 100%.
And not to mention, there is, I don't know if you want to call it a ripple effect or a network effect of that person's happiness and normalcy, how that's going to affect the people around her family and immediate friends and everything.
Yeah, it's so much of the profound effect that we get to experience at Insightec is magnified by caregivers. And I think it's because of the diseases we treat, but degenerative diseases, functional diseases require a high level of caregiver. And so it's rarely ever a patient showing up. It's a patient and their family show up, because you can't function with Parkinson's or essential tremor or neuropathic pain or epilepsy or brain tumor or Alzheimer's or ALS or rare pediatric disorders. You have a team around you, and that team feels every part of your journey that you feel. And I think it's why when we originally built this business, we had to develop a market. I'll tell you, essential tremor has 40 million people in this world that are diagnosed with essential tremor. It's bimodal in distribution. It's as much as it is in your 40s as it in your 80s. It's genetically linked down your maternal line. And the worst thing that anybody ever did was call it essential, because it almost makes it, a patient told me that one time. And they said, I do two things. I explain to people why I don't have Parkinson's, and I've reclused myself because I don't want to go get my head cut open and get brain surgery with implants. And so they accommodate disability, which is a really important thing to think about. Accommodating disability means that we failed. We failed at bringing that patient a solution. And 80% of these patients break through medications. And so it's an inevitability. And when I remember thinking and talking to some of the early centers when I was doing my diligence on Insightec as just a person of interest and maybe switching my whole focus and career, I remember the top centers in the world that were treating these patients with deep brain stimulation said, there's not that many out there. I'm the highest center in the world. I treat one patient a month, 12 patients a year. I remember thinking like, what am I missing? There's 40 million patients. More than half of them break through. 10% of those are so severe that they're completely disabled. And those are big numbers. And what we saw when we first started unleashing the power of focused ultrasound was huge amount of inquiry, not coming through neurologists or neurosurgeons, but directly from the patients and their families. And the first big centers started treating direct to physician. Patients would call the neurosurgeon. Usually this goes through a family medicine or a neurologist. It gets treated, it gets referred, et cetera, et cetera. These were saying, I want that. I want the focused ultrasound. They would call. And that got them at least in the door to show up. And maybe it wasn't always the best or the right thing for them. Most of the time it was, and made a huge impact. But it just gave those patients an opportunity to have a conversation. And it gave the physicians, more importantly, an opportunity to have a conversation with people otherwise that weren't reaching out to them. And I think just in that sheer market development effort, we've changed more than 10,000 patients and countless multiples of that in caregivers. And that's just with our first couple of years here getting going on essential tremor, and now Parkinson's building with multiple indications, and all of our drug delivery therapeutic indications in oncology. So we hope to make a huge impact, and that's only made much larger by the people that you impact beyond the patient, as you're saying here. So we owe it to them and to everybody to make sure that we're doing this in the right and best way possible.
One of the things that's interesting to me, like on the capital side, is that for me, my entire career has been marked by really expensive, first of its kind technology that doesn't really have a market. And so like you guys fit that perfectly. what have been some of the difficulties and barriers that you guys have faced when it comes to essentially selling this, right? So for example, what is if you feel comfortable talking about like the capital expenditure of the hospital, I'd imagine they have to build out a suite for this.
Yeah, not exactly. So yeah, I'll walk you through some of the complexities of the commercial business here, which with every complexity and challenge is the opportunity, right? And if you do it, you can do it right, you can completely shift the marketplace. And you have to have a vision of where you're taking this thing. And I think those are two things that have been unbelievable at Insightec. And the first one is, so MR guided focused ultrasound, which is the long version of the name, is effectively a helmet. It's a hemispheric array, and it sits on the bed of an MR table. A patient lays inside of it, and there's 1,000 plus elements independently positioned and all phased array. So each one kind of geolocates where it needs to go. And this one goes a shorter distance, this one goes a longer distance, but it's all phased array. So they fire at the right frequencies to meet each other at the point of interest to have collective energy and thus the therapy. So like that in itself is like mind blowing. And it's all done through the skull. And so the engineers in Insightec had to create what were mechanical into electrochemical connections to put it inside of an MR, right? Like second. And finally,
an MR that you guys don't own. So this is,
so we're compatible with GE and Siemens and now multiple advancing into Philips and other expansions down the line here. But let's just say we're compatible with the majority of MRs around the world. So we're a simple integration. There's a little bit of back end and front end, a software that sits at the interface of the MR suite. And then our helmet can come in and out of the MR. And so a hospital can do a diagnostic procedure, bring a patient in, do a therapy, bring them out, do a diagnostic, bring another one in. So it's very transferable in that nature. And there's the capital component of it. That's the hardest part. Capital sales into hospitals is when you're getting started, you're competing against robotics, you're competing against large things. They're a longer sales cycle. And the goal in this business is always to build the capital business sustainably and with enough of a growth pace to where you flip the entire business model to the treatment side, which is utilization based. You put box A in, and in its first year, maybe it sees 10 patients, but in its second year, it sees 100, and then it sees a run rate of 400 after that. It's much more predictable to say, okay, we're going to continue to see 400 or 500 patients a year than it is we're going to put box B, C, D, E, and F in, just because every hospital has its own sales cycle. Fortunately, the folks that came in and around this really built a lot of the history of capital sales and robotics. And we're taking a lot of lessons learned into this. And if you look at the investments, neurosciences, oncology, and genetic medicines are like the top 3 investments right now coming into medicine. And that puts us in a really unique position as a company because we work in all 3. And I think our number one goal is to bring as much access as possible. We're now in approximately 150 locations worldwide across all of North America, Europe, into Asia, the growth markets in Asia, Australia. More importantly, we have knocked down global value and access, global reimbursements on the private and public side, and gotten true connection with patients getting the service, not just having technology in a region that's inaccessible if you can cash pay only. It's there's a sequential strategy in place. We let our evidence speak for itself. We've always been an evidence-first company. Our first trial was a global randomized clinical trial published in the New England Journal. We've now subsequently published more Nature Science translation papers than any company I've ever been a part of, which is a testament to the science-led effort. And only recently, and I'd still say we're like the best kept secret in neurosciences, only recently did we start to gain public media attention.
yeah.
So Sanjay, yeah.
I saw you. Yeah, the Sanjay Gupta, and you're also on the Tony Robbins show, which was cool.
Yeah.
I'm glad you guys are finally doing it though, because I remember I've known about Insightec for a long time, but I never knew what they did until a couple years ago. And I remember thinking like, how the hell is this not being covered by every major news outlet? This is insane. So I'm very happy that I'm starting to see every other week I'm seeing something. So your marketing PR team's doing a good job.
Yeah. And I would say my marketing PR team is unbelievable. And we have the benefit of that. A lot of it gets brought to us or asked of us, as opposed to us trying to force position it in the marketplace. And I think let's lead with evidence, lead with growth, and thus it will come. And the last thing I'll say is that evidence is critically important, because what we do in our commercial business right now is we create a lesion in the brain. It's a pinpoint 0.3 millimeter directable lesion. But the term lesion, and this goes back to some of the complexities of medicine, the term lesion is a bad word from 20, 30 years ago when people tried to lesion with gamma radiation and other things that created crazy side effects, right? Hemibolisms, erratic speech, and profound safety effects. We have completely shifted that by using precision image guided, acoustic driven outcomes. But the perception of neurologists and neurosurgeons and some primary care physicians go back, they just hear ablation, they think about, wow, we're past that, right? Medicine has evolved beyond that. And so it's this constant education where sometimes it takes a patient seeing our work on 60 Minutes to then call their physician and say, you have to watch this. I need this. And then that gives more credibility to the other things that were produced as evidence. So you got to have as many people telling your story as possible so you constantly come back in the narrative. That's the only way that you reach patients.
100%. And just, I was going to mention to you like off air, but while we're on the topic, something I want to mention is that I would love to work with your team and figure out how we get one of the patients on the show. So just recently, there was a patient who I saw give a talk. He was a Parkinson's patient, and he had one of the devices from Abbott, and he's like living a normal life, and it was so powerful. And I started thinking, I'm like, I don't think enough people know about these stories. So I've had this interest to use the platform to amplify these patient stories. So I'd love to talk to you guys and figure out like if we can get a patient on to talk about their stories. I think it's really powerful, and we need to just find more ways to proliferate the internets with these kind of stories so people know that there is an option.
Couldn't agree more. It's a super thoughtful invitation, and I will definitely take you up on it.
As we like round things out, and again, I appreciate you coming on. I feel like we can go for many hours, but like you got stuff to do today. But just to round things out, I'm curious, having the career that you've had, the people that you've met and everything, there's some questions I have. For example, people are always looking for points of influence outside of like mentors, right? I'm wondering what kind of books had an impact and influence on your career and things that you feel like you recommend and gift most often.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's two that I come back to pretty often on the book side. One is the one that I give mostly to new members of my team when I bring folks on is It's the Hard Thing About Hard Things. And it was a book written by Ben Horowitz. And it's just an unbelievable narrative around the ultra lows of entrepreneurship, not necessarily the highs, but the perseverance through the ultra lows. And it's just like a reminder, you're just as smart as you are, as smart as people around you, market forces will bring many challenges. And having that perspective and seeing it as an opportunity and not, oh my gosh, we're never going to make it through this. That book was really profound on me. And then I feel funny saying this now because it's subsequently been turned into a movie. But for the longest, and I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know if the movie's terrible or great. But The Boys in the Boat was a book someone gifted me a long time ago. And it's this unbelievable story about a crew team out of the University of Washington. And no part of me has ever done crew, or I don't follow crew. And I remember even thinking like, crew, that sounds terrible. But it was a story about 12 individuals. And it was one of these sort of like biographical epics where you learn as much about the individual as you do about the global story. And it was this collegiate crew team that ended up going into Nazi Germany during the Olympics and beating the world's #1 Olympic team out of Germany. And it was this disparate crew of haphazards, but an unbelievable coach. And each one of them had their own superpower that they really didn't know about. But when they were brought together and curated, they created what was an ineffable and unbeatable team. And it's just this beautiful sense of completion at the end. And those two books, one represents the grit, one represents the team that I found myself really drawn to over the years.
Yeah, I'm ordering it now. Boys in the Boat, I'm not familiar with. I'm embarrassed I don't know about it because the thing has 87,000 reviews on Amazon. But that's a really profound story. But anytime I hear a story like that, so again, a scrappy team, different powers, they get combined together and they all row in the same direction. The first thing I think of, I'm like, God help us all for when like LinkedIn gets a hold of this story. Anytime I see like a story like this, I'm like, oh, great. I'm going to see like thousands of LinkedIn influencers about this one thing in a variety of ways. On the Ben Horowitz one, couldn't agree more. And actually, I love doing this, which is knowing exactly where the book is that's mentioned. And you're the first guest. It's this is, I don't know, by the time this is going to be out, this episode will be 160 or 70. You're the first guest to mention that book, but it's such a good book. And I have it like marked up. And what I love about this book is that most books on entrepreneurship or written by a CEO, it's always like about the success and, oh, it's all this. And that book is just absolute pure carnage. And it's just, this is like the reality of what it's like. And actually, I read that book before starting my own company. And I think it's just so good because it's one of those topics that like nobody really talks about. Nobody wants to seem to talk about it, but it's probably the most, that book is probably a lot more valuable in guiding you and your team than like any book that's like about the flowery, like good stuff.
I remember reading that book and being like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe this is happening. And there's no way they're going to get out of this. And then like to have a DMX quote, it was just this like ultra narrative that I like appreciate.
That's the part about Ben Horowitz I really appreciate is the fact that he has this deep love for rap music. And so he has these, the DMX quote, the rap lyrics. And then on his Instagram, like he, again, like when you're a billionaire and you're super successful, you can hang out with anybody. But I do love the fact that like on his spare time, he's like hanging out with rappers. It's just like really a different thing he's talking about. By the way, side note, after living in Silicon Valley for a few years, there are some key terms and phrases where without meeting somebody, I know that they lived in the Valley. So if I talk to somebody and they say y'all, I'm like, oh, they're from Texas, right? For the Valley, one of those words, because talking about like having outside interest and everything is the word orthogonal. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So for the audience who doesn't know what the hell I'm talking about, orthogonal means when two lines meet together as a right angle, but then in the context of what we're talking about is like two things that are statistically and qualitatively like very different. And so like orthogonally, like I'm a venture capitalist, but orthogonally, I'm like, I do fly fishing or something. I don't know. Yeah. I was waiting for that word to be dropped at some point, but maybe you've been in Miami long enough. Some of those, yeah, exactly.
At least we didn't say circle back or double click until now.
Oh man. So I told you I was like, this episode can go on for a while, but I got to pull it up. Every now and then I have a good tweet in me where I'm like, oh, that's good. And I saw this in a different version somewhere else, but I got to read this tweet for you, which is emails can be a crutch or your hammer. So most people write to whom it may concern, right? Which is weak, low energy, it's vague, and that's going to be ignored. Or you change one word and you say to whom it will concern, which is strong, it's menacing, and that's going to be remembered. So yeah, but the double click thing, man, I'm just like, here we go. Yeah. Or as per my last email.
Before, yes.
Absolutely. So just like rounding things out, I wanted to just touch on, and again, I appreciate you coming on the show. What, aside from Insightec, looking at 2024 and Medtech, what are some things that kind of got you excited about the industry?
Yeah, the convergence of access is a thesis I've been following for quite some time now. There's a couple of things I'm like deeply passionate about. The convergence of a technology or a tool that can obliterate a previous infrastructure requirement referred to as medical grade furniture, or the need to call, make an appointment, go see somebody and do this big fixed effect, whether it be in hearing healthcare, sleep care, to some extent, dental care, vision care, the things that are massive in requirements affect everybody, or only affecting people more and more as we have an aged population. Technologies that can provide as good, if not a better clinical benefit or effect, while at the same time making it a lower barrier to access and connecting all of it with a longitudinal data set that can measure whether or not a difference is being made. It's the first time in humanity that we have that true capability. And I have the privilege of personally being involved with a few different companies that are attacking this and attacking it more brilliantly than I could have imagined they would have, and making a big difference. I do think that the movement to home healthcare has to happen. I don't think it may happen. It has to happen. We won't have the dollars in our overall government expenditures to be able to continue to sustain. And we want to keep the hospitals for the things that matter the most. So when people need those, they get those. And everything else, we need to be more proactive, but evidence-based. And there's a lot of different consumer evidence approaches, but those aren't good enough clinically. So taking a consumer approach, but matching it with clinical evidence and an actual measurable outcome, there's real differences being made right now. And the second big narrative, I would say, of things that I think are going to really change the world. I think the onset of psychedelic medicine in mental health is going to be a massive benefit. And I think the huge challenge is how it will be delivered and the access with which it's coming. If it's going to be delivered, to me, is no longer a question. The clinical evidence of it is unbelievable. It surpasses anything we've ever seen in traditional sort of pharmacological approaches to some of the disease states. And I think that the world is waking up to what maybe societies thousands of years ago knew about the potential, only at the same time where the world is becoming a much more toxic place as it relates to mental health. And so we can't think that we're going to make a difference with a substandard set of care in an infrastructure that can't handle it, as it's only becoming a more obtuse challenge for us. We have to think differently. We have to think differently about where and how and what we deliver. And I think that the openness of the FDA, of the governing agencies, of, I pray, insurance companies, and of care delivery for this is going to be really dramatic. And I'm excited about things like AI, and I think that they'll help. That we're still in a hypothesis pondering mode. I think there's a lot we need to do with the structured data to make it actually actionable. But those are real accretive things that excite me today, things that I'm involved in, and either in governance or investment or support or advisory, that I think are going to make a big difference for people's lives.
Okay, completely agree. And I think you said something earlier in our talk about, I guess you said the brain was the organ of the decade. Was that
Century.
of the century? Yeah, organ of the century. I think while that was the organ of the century, I think like the frontier of the future is going to be the mind. And I think because there's so many things about the mind that you can't, science hasn't found a way to directly measure or explain, but it is a huge implication. I think one of the bigger epidemics that happened post-COVID was like the mental health crisis. And so like the psychedelic medicine has been really interesting. And I'm excited to see more innovation there. On the consumer side, something that I personally, and I think something happened, like COVID was an inflection point in humanity, I think, in the sense that I think these things were trending, but it just accelerated. So like there's a mass psychological interest now in the general population with health and medicine. And just like a tiny example is I work in this industry, but I know a lot of people who are not in healthcare who are like me, which is I wear a Whoop device. So I'm measuring all my vitals every day, my HRV and everything. Just recently, like I'm paying cash for a continuous glucose monitor. And there's this constant interest from the public in these modalities. And I feel like that's going to have such again, on the funding side, a positive effect on bringing in more money to the industry, also for clinical trials and everything. I know this is a cliche thing to say, but I really mean, I think there hasn't been a more exciting time to be in medicine than today.
Totally agree. To make a difference. Totally agree.
100%. JJ, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. You definitely have to come back. We got to figure out a way where I come to Miami. We got to do this in person. But in the meantime, like, where can people find you online?
The easiest place to find me. So I don't really have much of an online presence. It's funny. I'll just share a story. I told my wife this last week, I presented it at this summit called FII. And I was like, hey, I had a pretty great talk today and I got a lot of great responses. And she was like, oh, that's nice. And then that night we were sitting in bed and she goes, holy cow, did you see this? And like someone had put it on Instagram and like this reel. And so I'm not available in that aspect, but my email is jj@insightec.com. I gave it out with Tony. I probably had 1,000 patients reach out to me. Every single one gets a response. Every medical student or person that's trying to figure out how to blend micro and macro views of healthcare together, I always try to make it a point to connect back with those people because I was that person, and the folks that connected back with me changed their lives. I hope to just provide some advice. It's maybe worth what you pay for it at some points, but that's probably the easiest way to reach me. And hopefully through connections and great humans that know me would be the second best way of doing it.
Awesome. Fantastic. JJ, thank you so much for coming on the show. For those who are listening, be sure to give Insightec a follow. Check out JJ. You are on LinkedIn.
And LinkedIn, yes.
And LinkedIn. There you go. Not TikTok, not no TikTok, but yeah, exactly. You got 4 kids, so one of them is going to pressure you into doing TikTok. I can't wait to see the TikTok dances and everything. But with that being said, to the audience who's listening, this has been another episode of the State of Medtech. Be sure to follow, the show because we release a lot of podcasts that we don't promote directly. And if you haven't already, give the show 5 stars, write a review. It means a lot. So that being said, I'm your host, Omar Khateeb. We'll see you all next time. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who'd really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.